was a quiet afternoon in the heart of the city, the kind of day where nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. People went about their business, lost in their own worlds, unaware that in just a few moments, a single encounter would spark a chain of events so shocking it would leave an entire courtroom speechless. This is the story of a white woman, a black girl, and a moment that would change everything. The woman, let's call her Karen, was walking her dog in the park when she noticed a young black girl sitting on a bench. The girl, no older than 20, was quietly reading a book, her headphones on, completely absorbed in her own world. But something about her presence seemed to bother Karen. Maybe it was the way the girl was dressed, casual but confident. Or maybe it was the fact that she seemed so at ease in a space Karen considered her own. Whatever the reason, Karen's discomfort grew until she could no longer ignore it. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice sharp and accusatory. The girl looked up, startled, and removed her headphones. "Yes," she replied, her tone polite but guarded. Karen didn't waste any time. "What are you doing here? This is a private neighborhood. You don't belong here." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The girl blinked, taken aback. But before she could respond, Karen pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she declared, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and self-righteousness. The girl sighed, clearly used to this kind of treatment, but there was something different about her this time. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply sat back down, closed her book, and waited. Minutes later, a police car pulled up, its lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but professional. Karen rushed over. To them, pointing at the girl. "She's trespassing," she said, her voice rising. "I don't know what she's doing here, but she doesn't belong." The officers approached the girl, who remained calm and composed. "Ma'am, can we see some ID?" one of them asked. The girl nodded, reached into her bag, and pulled out a small leather wallet. She opened it slowly, revealing a badge that made both officers freeze. It wasn't just any badge. It was a CIA badge gleaming under the sunlight. The officers exchanged a glance, their demeanor shifting instantly. Karen, still standing a few feet away, didn't see the badge, but she noticed the change in the officer's body language. "What's going on?" she demanded, her voice tinged with confusion and frustration. The girl stood up, her eyes locking onto Karen's. "You called the police on me," she said, her voice steady but laced with something unreadable. "But you didn't bother to ask who I am or why I'm here." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The officers stepped back, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The girl took a step forward, her presence commanding the pace. "You assumed," she continued, "and now you're about to find out just how wrong you were." The tension in the air was palpable. Karen's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and fear. The officers looked on, their hands hovering near their belts, unsure of what to do next. And the girl? She stood tall, her badge still in hand, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. But before she could say another word, one of the officers spoke up. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," he said, his voice firm but respectful. Karen's eyes widened. "What? Why? She's the one who—" But the officer cut her off. "This is a matter of national security," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. And just like that, the scene shifted. Karen was led to the police car, her protests growing louder and more desperate. The girl watched silently, her expression unreadable. As the car drove away, she turned and walked off, disappearing into the crowd as quickly as she had appeared. But this wasn't the end. In fact, it was only the beginning. Because what happened next would take this story from shocking to unbelievable, leaving everyone involved, and everyone watching, utterly speechless. What was the girl doing in that park? Why did she have a CIA badge? And what did this mean for Karen, who had just made the biggest mistake of her life? The answers to these questions would unfold in a courtroom drama that no one could have predicted. But for now, all we know is this. Sometimes the people we underestimate are the ones who hold the most power. And sometimes, The consequences of our actions are far greater than we could ever imagine. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her lawyer, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a suit that looked like it had seen better days, leaned over to whisper something in her ear. Karen nodded, but her eyes were fixed on the door at the back of the room. She was waiting for the girl to walk in, the girl whose life she had tried to upend with a single phone call. But this wasn't just about Karen anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that no one in the room fully understood. Yet, the girl, whose name was revealed to be Amara Johnson, entered the courtroom with the same calm confidence she had shown in the park. She wasn't dressed in the casual clothes she had been wearing that day. Instead, she wore a sharp, tailored suit, her CIA badge clipped to her belt. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as she took her seat at the witness stand. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and glasses perched on the edge of her nose, adjusted her robe and turned to Amara. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Amara Johnson," the girl replied, her voice steady. "I'm a field operative with the Central Intelligence Agency." The words hung in the air, and you could almost hear the gears turning in everyone's minds. A CIA operative? In their small town? What was she doing here? Karen's lawyer stood up, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, if I may," he began. But the judge held up a hand to silence him. "Not now, counselor," she said. "Let's hear what Ms. Johnson has to say." Amara took a deep breath and began to speak. She explained that she had been in the park that day as part of an undercover operation. She didn't go into details, national security and all that, but she made it clear that her presence there was anything but random. "I was conducting surveillance on a person of interest," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "Someone who has been linked to activities that pose a significant threat to national security." The room erupted in murmurs, and the judge had to bang her gavel to restore order. Karen's face turned pale. She had thought she was doing the right thing by calling the police, but now she wasn't so sure. Her lawyer stood up again, this time more forcefully. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," he said. "My client had no way of knowing who this woman was or what she was doing there. She was simply acting out of concern for her community." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" she said, her tone skeptical. "Ms. Johnson, would you care to respond?" Amara leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Karen's. "Your client didn't ask any questions," she said, her voice calm but firm. "She saw a young black woman sitting on a bench and assumed I didn't belong there. She didn't ask what I was doing. She didn't ask if I needed help. She just called the police. And in doing so, she compromised an ongoing federal investigation." The words hit Karen like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. The judge turned to Karen's lawyer. "Counselor, your client's actions have serious implications. This isn't just a case of mistaken identity. This is about the potential disruption of a federal operation. Do you understand the gravity of the situation?" The lawyer nodded, but he looked like a man who had just realized he was in over his head. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As the hearing continued, more details began to emerge. Amara explained that the person of interest she had been surveilling was someone with ties to a dangerous international organization. She didn't name names, but she made it clear that this wasn't some small-time criminal. This was someone who posed a real threat, not just to the community, but to the country as a whole. "If my cover had been blown," she said, her voice tinged with frustration, "it could have had catastrophic consequences." Karen sank lower in her seat, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who looked out for her neighbors and did the right thing. But now she wasn't so sure. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had acted in good faith, but even he seemed to realize that his arguments were falling flat. The judge wasn't having it. "Good faith or not," she said, "the fact remains that your client's actions could have put lives at risk. That's not something we can simply overlook." As the hearing drew to a close, the judge announced that she would need time to review the evidence and consider her ruling. In the meantime, Karen was ordered to remain in custody. The look on her face as the bailiffs led her away was one of pure disbelief. She had started the day as a concerned citizen, and now she was facing the possibility of serious legal consequences. It was a stark reminder that actions, no matter how well-intentioned, can have far-reaching effects. But the story didn't end there. As Amara left the courtroom, she was approached by a man in a dark suit. He whispered something in her ear, and her expression changed. She nodded, then quickly made her way out of the building. Whatever was happening, it was clear that this was far from over. The person of interest she had been surveilling was still out there, and now, thanks to Karen's interference, they knew they were being watched. The stakes had been raised and the clock was ticking. Back in her cell, Karen sat on the edge of her cot, staring at the floor. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something much bigger than herself. She thought about Amara, about the calm confidence she had shown even in the face of adversity. She thought about the judge's words, about the potential consequences of her actions. And she thought about the person of interest, the one who was still out there, still a threat. What had she done? And more importantly, what was going to happen next? The answers to those questions would come, but not yet. For now, all Karen could do was wait. Wait and wonder. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that no one in that courtroom fully understood. And as the hours ticked by, one thing became clear. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. As the days passed, the small town buzzed with whispers and speculation. News of the courtroom drama had spread like wildfire, and everyone had an opinion. Some people sided with Karen, arguing that she had only been trying to protect her community. Others saw her as a symbol of everything wrong with society, a woman who had let her biases cloud her judgment, with consequences that could have been catastrophic. But for Amara, the focus wasn't on Karen anymore. It was on the person of interest she had been tracking, the one who had slipped through her fingers because of the disruption in the park. Amara spent her days working closely with her team, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The man in the dark suit who had approached her after the hearing was her supervisor, Agent Daniels. He had been in the intelligence game for decades, and his face bore the lines of a man who had seen too much. "We need to move fast," he told her during a late-night briefing. "If they know we're on to them, they'll go underground. And if that happens, we might never find them again." Amara nodded, her mind racing. She had been so close to getting the information they needed to take down a network that had been operating in the shadows for years. And now they were back to square one. Meanwhile, Karen sat in her cell, her mind a whirlwind of regret and confusion. She had been allowed one phone call, and she had used it to reach out to her sister, Emily. Emily had always been the level-headed one in the family, the one who could see both sides of a situation. When she visited Karen, the two sisters sat across from each other, separated by a thick pane of glass. "What were you thinking?" Emily asked, her voice a mix of concern and frustration. Karen shook her head. "I wasn't thinking," she admitted. I saw her sitting there and I assumed the worst. I didn't stop to ask questions. I didn't even consider that she might have a reason to be there." Emily sighed. "You've always been quick to judge, Karen. But this time it might cost you everything." Karen's lawyer was doing his best to build a defense, but it was an uphill battle. The prosecution had painted her as reckless, someone who had acted on impulse without considering the consequences. And then there was the matter of the ongoing investigation. The judge had made it clear that Karen's actions had potentially jeopardized national security, and that wasn't something the court was going to take lightly. "We need to find a way to show that you didn't intend to cause harm," her lawyer told her during one of their meetings. "But even then, it's Going to be tough, and this isn't just about you anymore, it's about the bigger picture. As the investigation into the person of interest intensified, Amara found herself grappling with her own emotions. She had dedicated her life to protecting her country, to making sure that people like Karen could live their lives without fear. But the incident in the park had shaken her in ways she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the disruption to the operation that bothered her. It was the reminder that, no matter how much she accomplished, there were still people who would judge her based on the color of her skin. She had always known this, of course, but knowing it and experiencing it were two very different things. One evening, as she sat in her apartment going over case files, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her best friend, Marcus. "You okay?" It read. Amara hesitated before replying. "I've been better," she typed. Marcus called her immediately. "Talk to me," he said, his voice warm and familiar. Amara sighed. "It's just, this whole thing has me thinking about why I do what I do, about whether it's even worth it sometimes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You're one of the strongest people I know," he said finally. "But even the strongest people need to vent. So vent. I'm here." As Amara opened up to Marcus, Karen was having a heart-to-heart with Emily. "I don't know how to fix this," Karen admitted, her voice breaking. "I don't even know if it can be fixed." Emily reached out, her hand resting on the glass. "Between them, you can't change what happened," she said gently. "But you can change how you move forward. Start by understanding why you did what you did. And then you need to make amends. Not just for your sake, but for everyone's." The tension in the town continued to build as the days turned into weeks. The person of interest was still out there, and Amara and her team were working around the clock to track them down. But every lead seemed to hit a dead end, and the pressure was mounting. Meanwhile, Karen's trial date was approaching, and the media was having a field day. The story had gone viral, with hashtags and hot takes flooding social media. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had the full story. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more complicated, a new piece of information came to light. During a routine check of surveillance footage, Amara noticed something unusual. A car that had been parked near the park that day, a car that didn't belong to anyone in the neighborhood. She zoomed in on the license plate, her heart racing. "Daniels?" she called, her voice urgent. "I think we've got something." But before she could say more, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. "You're getting too close," it read. "Back off, or else." Amara stared at the screen, her mind racing. Was this a threat? A warning? Or something else entirely? She didn't have time to think about it, because at that moment, Daniels burst into the room, his face pale. "We've got a problem," he said. "A big one." The story was far from over. In fact, it was only getting more complicated. With the trial looming, the investigation heating up, and new threats emerging, the stakes were higher than ever. And as the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, one thing became clear. No one was safe. Not Karen, not Amara, not anyone. Because in a world where assumptions could lead to chaos and secrets could destroy lives, the only thing certain was uncertainty, and the only way out was through. But what lay on the other side? That was the question no one could answer, yet.